Hi everyone, Dr. Garrett Carden here. In the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are going to try to continue as normally as possible. I hope that you and your loved ones are all safe. I have self-quarantined for right now, and we're going to try to continue as normally as possible through these virtual videos. So, last time we met, we had just finished up Chapter 4, and your Exam 2 was over Chapter 3 and 4, so we're going to be starting Chapter 5. Now, Chapter 5 starts off by discussing how the social structure has changed over time. Now, there's a lot of diversity in each one of the stages of social evolution that we're about to start talking about. What we have done for the purposes of this class is to talk about a collection of themes that these types of societies have. But keep in mind that each one of these societies that we're about to discuss have a lot of variety. There's a lot of difference between them. And so while we can talk about some general themes that are held in common, that's not to say that every, for instance, hunter-and-gatherer society is going to be just like every other hunter-and-gatherer society. That's not the case at all. So, hunter-and-gatherer society. Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a society where the economy is entirely dependent upon what can be gathered in terms of vegetation as well as what can be hunted. Oftentimes these are nomadic societies that follow the migration patterns of prey animals. There are not many hunter-gatherer societies left. There are a few, but they were largely killed off during the age of European imperialism and colonialism. And so they were deemed as quote-unquote primitive at the time, and that was used in part as a moral justification for wiping such cultures out. So that's a big part of the reason why there's really not many left. There are a few examples. So, what are some basic similarities? Well, these societies tend to be small, though that's not always the case. About 25 to 40 members tends to be about it. There's still a few of these kinds of tribes left in South America, but again, not many whatsoever. Now, the hunters within these societies are typically male, from what we know of the societies that have survived, and usually are given the greatest prestige for hunting activities, whereas gatherers tend to be women and children. However, the activities of gathering tend to bring in about 80% of the total food for the entire society. So while it's considered lower prestige, it's still actually the main source of nutrition for the group. Now, there's very little social differentiation at this point in time. People pretty much live similar lives to one another, almost exactly the same. We've talked about Durkheim and mechanical societies. And so this would certainly fit within that category, or what Tonys would call Gemeinschaft. All right, so there is, however, typically some kind of healing specialist or spiritual specialist that will be the respected leader of the group, typically referred to as a shaman in anthropological literature. It's also been called in American pop culture by the name that's considered today to be offensive, which is witch doctor. Now, these would be people who, this is culture and society epistemologically. So in terms of how they know the world and how they approach knowledge, These are people who are understanding things not through our germ theory of sickness, for instance, but would be using more of a spiritual kind of understanding. So, for instance, if you see a sick child, it's not because of the spread of a virus or bacteria. Trying to explain that to somebody from this kind of a society or cultural background, you would sound like you were nuts. So, okay, there are these tiny little things that are alive, that enter your body, that you can't see and you can't prove to me. But that's truly what's making me sick. No, it's the rival tribe from across the way sending evil spirits our way. That explanation just within their cultural framework would make much more sense to them. Whereas our germ theory would sound relatively absurd to them. So, this would be the earliest kind of social differentiation we would see, with leadership in the hands of shamans, also councils of elders, whatnot. Now, about 10,000 years ago, we end up having, especially in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, around the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, we end up seeing the domestication revolution. Now, there are a series of major social revolutions. If I had a chalkboard, I would write on there, domestication revolution. It's in your books. Make sure that you look it up. It happened 10,000 years ago, and it's the first evidence that we have where humans have domesticated plants and animals. Now, some societies put more emphasis on horticultural, and so, in other words, in cultivating plants, whereas others ended up putting more of a focus on pasturing animals, in which case that led to two types of basic social types, or types of society, is what I'm trying to say. And so, pastoral societies would be those societies that are much more focused on things like animal husbandry. Horticultural societies would be those that obviously are more focused on the pasturing of plants. Now, it's one thing that to keep in mind, that these are not mutually exclusive, and pastoral society is going to be cultivating plants, just like a horticultural society will also end up practicing some animal husbandry. So it's a question of degree, not either or. So the main point here, though, is that the domestication revolution allows humanity to stop its nomadic roots and settle down, and start building permanent settlements. This becomes huge for social development. It's why we call it out as one of the major social revolutions. Now, the division of labor starts to become more complex. Keep in mind that the division of labor is directly responsible for the degree of complexity within a society. At least that's the leading theory in Durkheimian sociology. So, in this sense then, part of what ends up happening with the greater complexity and the division of labor is you start to see social differentiation, unlike you would have in, say, the hunter-gatherer societies. So we start to see certain people being able to accumulate more wealth. Now, these would be people, for instance, oftentimes who are using common grounds that would be used for the entire group, the entire tribe. And so these would be those people who would, say, for instance, add another goat or another sheep or what have you to their herd, and would thus end up leading to something we call in sociology the tragedy of the commons, where those who are most selfish end up getting the most benefit at the expense of everyone else. And so it is actually the very idea, the tragedy of the commons, that ends up leading to this first kind of social differentiation based on wealth. And keep in mind, when I say wealth, I'm talking about how much land you have, how much whatever the plant that your society is focusing on for horticulture, how much of that you're able to stockpile, how large your herd of animals are. This is the kind of wealth that I'm referring to, not capital in some modern sense. Alright, so about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, we end up getting the second major social revolution, called the agricultural revolution. Now, the agricultural revolution is remarkable for a couple of things. First of all, and it is the part that your textbook focuses on, it was the invention of plowing. The plow, and particularly a plow with a metal tip, and the working of metal into farming ended up allowing for agriculture on scales never before seen. So you ended up starting to see large-scale farming. Now, there's another thing that occurred 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in different parts of the world, and that's the invention of writing. And so what happens? What do you invent when you invent writing? Well, let me ask a different question, related question. What is history? History is humans recording what we do and how the world around us and us, how we change over time. And so, if you invent writing, you've also, in a way, invented history. So this is where we make this distinction between something that's being historical or is in the historical record. In other words, we have a written record of something that had happened 5,000 years ago, versus something that's prehistorical, where we might want to turn to, say, the archaeological record, for instance, for our evidence. All right, so agricultural revolution ended up leading to agricultural society. Agricultural society is a society based on large-scale agriculture, exactly like the name implies. Oh, by the way, this is also why a lot of people believe in some parts of the world that the planet is only 5,000 to 6,000 years old. And in a way, they're right, in the sense that human history is about 5,000 to 6,000 years old. Obviously, the world, though, itself, as a material object, is much older. All right. Now, in agricultural societies, we start to see social differentiation also in terms of gender. Now, there is an old question, an old research question, going back decades, really, and that is, why did men pick up metalworking? There is nothing inherent to metalworking that would give men or women an advantage. Why did men and women not both pick up metalworking? But the evidence that we have would suggest that it was mainly men who ended up taking over metalworking. And as such, the metalworking came with a high degree of status and prestige. And so this is something that would be a question for current sociologists, future sociologists. There are people currently trying to figure out a answer to this question: is why did men take up metalworking? And one of the things that ended up doing, though, was also injecting social differentiation in the form of sexism. So, the next big social revolution, and one that you probably have all heard about in your high school history classes. The Industrial Revolution. Now, your textbook has the Industrial Revolution as beginning in England, 1765. That's not wrong. It's just very specific, isn't it? They picked that date because that was the first time a steam engine was created that had large-scale industrial applications. Steam engines had existed beforehand, they just weren't very efficient. And so, the 1765, you end up getting the first type of steam engine that has these large-scale kinds of applications. This ends up leading to industrial society. The industrial society being one that is based on production using fuels, whether it be steam, whether it be fossil fuels. And so industrial society is a switch away from using animal muscle, which is what we typically would use in the past, to using machines with fuel. All right. Now, industrial society ended up causing social differentiation to explode. You have all these different industries. You have the division of labor is dividing and subdividing. You have people who work in the same company who are doing radically different things. I mean, depending on if you're working in the office building as part of middle management versus if you're on the board of trustees versus if you're the line worker in the factory. And so we end up seeing that wealth accumulation really starts to build at the top at this point in time. And we start to see, for the first time ever, within the same social group, the same society, people who were able to effectively burn money versus those who were dying of starvation. So, you also need to know that the Industrial Revolution, there's been more than one Industrial Revolution. The first one is where we just switched to using fuel of some sort, so the steam engine would be the appropriate time to date that. But we would also say that there's a second Industrial Revolution that occurred across the 19th century, and that's marked largely by a switch to fossil fuels, oil, as well as the rise of factories and assembly lines. Then there's a third Industrial Revolution, sometimes also referred to as the Silicon Revolution, which refers to the silicon microprocessing chip, or in other words, the invention of the computer. So, we end up also seeing that these kinds of social differentiation based on wealth is something that ends up leading to a reorganization of society. And so society in the past was organized according to status. Many societies were feudal. You had feudalism in China, feudalism in Japan, you had feudalism throughout Europe. And so feudalism was a very common form of social organization that was more based on the family you were born into and who you were, rather than how much you own or how much you have. So we end up seeing that the Industrial Revolution gave birth to class-based organization, where people's social location was much more tied to what they owned and how much money and wealth they had. So we also end up seeing that, for instance, we've talked about the Marxian perspective of two great classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Well, in Marx's day, that would have been much clearer, much more obvious. in the 1800s, where you had what was, for that time period, the super wealthy, and then you had everyone else. But even in Marx's day, you had a group that was in the middle that he called the petit bourgeois. Rentiers were one group that would be an example of that. Rentiers would be people who owned property and then rented out property, and then, so they're rentiers. Now, these were people who would form a middle class of the 19th century. But different class formations end up coming out of different histories. And so the middle class of the 20th century was actually created by the fight against the growing wealth and abuse of the robber barons. In the 1890s to the 1920s, you start getting these fights, unionization. Now, I'm picking up closer to the 20th century, and I don't mean to imply that that's when all of this started. Keep in mind, and I believe I've mentioned this in class in person, that it was 1848 that the working class in Europe almost overthrew many Western European governments. And so this fight against industrial society's growing social differentiation is also a much older fight than that. However, I'm picking up the story when I am because I want to talk about how the middle class was formed in the 20th century in the United States. And that was a direct result of unionization. And so union workers were able to argue for things like the 8-hour workday, 5-day work week, more safety regulations, better retirement benefits, health care, and it allowed them to provide a really solid economic foundation for their children, who then later in the 20th century went to college and started building the middle class through higher education. That none of that would have been possible over the course of the 20th century, though, had it not been for the fight of labor during this time period. Now, we also no longer live in an industrial society. There are industrializing societies, of course, and we'll talk about that later on in the semester. But as far as the United States, Western Europe, Australia, Canada, what we generally refer to as the West, and keep in mind that's not necessarily geographic, obviously, if we're counting places like Australia and New Zealand, it's more cultural, and so it'd be those societies and cultures descended from Europe, and particularly Western Europe. Now, one of the things that we see with the third industrial revolution, which was the invention of the silicon microprocessing chip, is the formation of post-industrial or information societies. Information societies, one of the things you have to understand is information becomes the same thing as currency in many ways. Actually, information is arguably more valuable than currency. Information itself works almost as like as capital itself in an information society. And so that's why companies want all of your information. Now, your personal information is not that valuable individually. However, when you get mass amounts of information in an information society, and you can then aggregate that, and you can run extrapolations in terms of patterns of voting behavior, buying behavior, what have you, then the information is very much valuable as an aggregate. So, post-industrial society, as the name implies, you're no longer producing things. You've moved to a consumer-based society. That's why trying to bring manufacturing jobs back to America is really not going to be feasible in the long run. The reason being is that we've already shifted these sites of production off to areas with horrible workers' rights histories, horrible environmental regulations or the lack of enforcement of them. And so labor's cheap, production process is cheap, the cost is high in terms of human life and environmental damage, but, well, we can consume cheaply in America. So, the problem is, if you move these manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., you've got to do one of two things. You either have to pay people enough to be able to afford these products because these corporations are not going to take a hit in the profits, and that's the other place it could come from. If you want to move manufacturing back in the U.S. and get corporations to accept fewer profits, then you could sell commodities for a comparable price without the price having to go up too much. However, it's highly unlikely that corporations would ever agree to do that willingly. And so what we end up seeing is that you would have to recreate the labor conditions in the places where we've moved sites of production. So at this point in time, we are a consumer society with just a few examples of production-based economics. Oil refinery being one big one. We still have a car industry in the United States, and so there's still production-based economics. Now, we also end up seeing, by the way, the post-industrial society, the birth of the post-industrial society ended up coming about because of the Third Industrial Revolution, in case that wasn't clear. And our little kitty, Cory Mari, is coming to join our class now. She's down here making herself very much known to me, though you can't see her, she's off camera. So, now there is a debate among sociologists about whether or not we've entered into a new type of social structure. Now, this is, again, I hope you notice that these changes in society have been driven by the economy, which has altered the division of labor. Altering the division of labor alters the social structure, the way that the society is actually organized. So the debate now is whether or not we've moved into what has generally been termed biotech society. So, biotech society. The debate is this. Is biotech society, which is defined as a society based on manufacturing goods and services through the manipulation of genetic codes, is that really that different from a post-industrial society, an information society? I mean, after all, the genetic code is just a different kind of information. Or is it that because we are altering and producing things through altering the code of life itself, if you would allow me to use kind of poetic language, it somehow sets us apart as a society from just manipulating ones and zeros on computer CPU. So, some examples of biotech society. We are splicing human DNA with other animal DNA. We've been doing that for decades. I believe it was DuPont who first introduced in the 90s oncomouse, onco being the Greek root for cancer. And so it was a mouse that was spliced with human genetic information for increasing the probability of developing cancer. And the idea was you could develop better cancer treatments for humans by studying how the cancer grows on mice. Since then, we've just, 90s, we saw cloning. The first sheep was cloned in Scotland, Dolly. Um, for those of you who enjoy deep sea fishing, there are goats now that have been spliced with spider DNA that produce spider silk in their milk. Actually, once strained out, is much stronger than steel, much stronger than anything on the market today. It's used not only for deep sea fishing lure lines, because how difficult they are to see and how strong they are, but also is stronger than Kevlar. Is starting to be used as a Kevlar replacement. There's the genetic manipulation of corn, and looking for a way of making corn fight herpes virus, or actually provide a form of birth control. You've got CRISPR on the market, you can buy on Amazon, and people with no training whatsoever can end up experimenting with their own genetic code. So, now, there's a lot of different ways of talking about organizing societies. We've just now talked about the big macro level kinds of social organizations and evolutions. But there are also much smaller ways that we can end up organizing these societies as well. And so my next lecture will end up looking into some of those. Thank you, and I will talk with you again soon.